In this video, you will meet all the criminals currently awaiting execution in the state of Florida. In total, the state has 261 inmates sentenced to death. 160 are white men, 89 are black men, and there is only one woman on the entire list. Dennis Sokor. On the night of December 31st, 1981, Dennis Sokor, 26, met 18-year-old Patricia Marie Gifford at a bar in Broward, Florida. After spending the night together, Sokor convinced Patricia to go out for breakfast, but instead of taking her to a restaurant, he drove her to a secluded spot where he attempted to sexually assault her. When she resisted, he strangled her. The body was never found. A disturbing image remained as evidence: the last photo of Patricia alive, with Sokor appearing behind her. In 1987, a jury found him guilty of kidnapping and first-degree murder, recommending the death penalty, which was imposed that same year. Since then, he has spent 38 years on death row without a date set for his execution until 2025. James Franklin Rose. In 1976, at the age of 30, James Franklin Rose kidnapped and brutally murdered 8-year-old Lisa Berry, the daughter of his ex-girlfriend, striking her with a hammer in Broward County. Sentenced to death in 1977, in 2015, DNA evidence linked him to the 1975 rape and murder of Jean Savage, a crime he later confessed to, receiving an additional life sentence as part of a plea deal. Today, at 79, Rose has spent 48 years on death row, and no execution date has been set. Harry Franklin Phillips. In 1982, in Dade County, Harry Franklin Phillips carried out a revenge killing by shooting his parole officer, Bjorn Svensson, after his parole had been revoked. Svensson was gunned down in the parking lot of the Miami parole office, shot in the chest, head, and back. Just a week earlier, shots had also been fired at the homes of 2 parole officers involved in his case, pointing to a pattern of harassment. Phillips was sentenced to death in 1984 and resentenced in 1994. Now 80 years old, he has spent 41 years on death row with no execution date scheduled. William Thomas Zeigler. In 1975, Tommy Zeigler was accused of one of Florida's most controversial crimes: the Christmas Eve murders of his wife Eunice, his in-laws Perry and Virginia Edwards, and a customer, Charlie Mays, inside the family furniture store in Winter Garden. 2 victims were shot, 2 were beaten to death, and nearly 30 shots were fired at the scene. Zeigler, found with a gunshot wound to his abdomen, claimed he was the victim of a robbery, but prosecutors argued he staged the scene to collect $500,000 in life insurance. Despite inconsistencies in the case, including witness recantations and the judge overruling a jury recommendation for life imprisonment, Zeigler was sentenced to death in 1976. Now 79, he has spent 49 years on death row with no execution date set. Henry P. Sireci. On December 3, 1975, Henry Sireci murdered used car dealer Howard Petit in Florida by stabbing him more than 50 times and slashing his throat during a violent struggle. The victim suffered multiple wounds across his body and died from massive internal and external bleeding. Convicted of first-degree murder, Sireci was sentenced to death on November 16, 1976. Now 76 years old, he has spent 48 years on death row with no execution date scheduled. Harold G. Lucas. In 1976, 21-year-old Harold G. Lucas murdered his 16-year-old ex-girlfriend Jill Piper in a crime driven by jealousy, drugs, and violence. After a day of heavy drinking and drug use, he confronted Jill at her home, shooting her outside before following her inside and fatally wounding her. He also shot and seriously injured 2 of her companions, Ricky Byrd and Terry Rice. Lucas was convicted of premeditated murder on September 2, 1977, and sentenced to death, along with 2 additional 30-year sentences for attempted murder. He has now spent 47 years on death row with no execution date set. James Ernest Hitchcock. In 1976, 20-year-old James Ernest Hitchcock was unemployed and had moved in with his brother Richard and his family in Orlando, Florida. On the night of July 31st, after drinking with friends, he returned home, entered the room of his 13-year-old niece by marriage, Cynthia Driggers, and after inappropriate contact and an altercation, strangled her. He was sentenced to death on February 11, 1977, with his sentence overturned and reinstated multiple times, 1988, 1993, 1996. Hitchcock has spent 47 years on death row at Union Correctional Institution and has no scheduled execution date. William Lee Thompson. In March 1976, 24-year-old William Lee Thompson participated in the brutal murder of Sally Ivester at a Miami motel. Thompson and his accomplice, Rocco Saras, tortured her for hours, beating her with chains, burning her with cigarettes, and sexually assaulting her with blunt objects. After an extortion attempt went wrong, Thompson was sentenced to death in 1978, with his sentence overturned and reinstated several times. Executions were scheduled in 1984 and 1990, but postponed. He has spent 47 years on death row at Union Correctional Institution, and as of 2025, has no execution date. Paul Scott. In 1978, 22-year-old Paul Scott, along with co-defendant Richard Condian, murdered James Alessi in Palm Beach County, Florida. After a violent struggle, Alessi was found dead, bound, and severely beaten, with a skull fracture causing death. Scott and Condian ransacked the home, stole jewelry from Alessi's shop, and took his car. Arrested in California a month later, Scott was sentenced to death on December 14, 1979. He has spent 45 years on death row at Union Correctional Institution. His executions were scheduled twice but postponed, and he has no execution date as of 2025. Bryan Frederick Jennings. In 1979, 20-year-old Bryan Frederick Jennings broke into the Kanash family home in Brevard County, Florida. He abducted 6-year-old Rebecca Kanash from her bed, assaulted her by fracturing her skull against the ground, and then drowned her in a nearby canal. Jennings was arrested shortly after, and evidence, including his confession, inmate testimony, and fingerprints, led to his conviction. On February 11, 1980, he was sentenced to death, along with 4 life sentences for other charges. As of 2025, Jennings has spent 45 years on death row with no execution date scheduled. Etheria Verdell Jackson. In 1985, 31-year-old Etheria Verdell Jackson attacked Linton Moody, a 64-year-old furniture store owner, at the home of Linda Riley in Jacksonville, Florida. Jackson bound, gagged, and choked Moody, then repeatedly stabbed him in the chest and left his body in a rolled-up carpet in a car. Jackson was arrested soon after, and evidence, including Riley's testimony, led to his conviction. On August 8, 1986, he was sentenced to death. As of 2025, Jackson has spent 39 years on death row with no execution date scheduled. Kenneth Darcell Quince. In 1979, 20-year-old Kenneth Darcell Quince entered the home of an 82-year-old woman in Volusia County, Florida, sexually assaulted her, and strangled her to death. Fingerprint evidence and his confession led to his arrest and conviction. On August 11, 1980, he pleaded guilty to first-degree felony murder and burglary, waiving his right to a jury for sentencing, and was sentenced to death. As of 2025, Quince has spent 45 years on death row with no execution date scheduled. James Robertson. In 2008, 46-year-old James Robertson strangled his cellmate, Frank Hart, at the Charlotte Correctional Institution in Florida using a makeshift garrote made from socks. Robertson, who had spent nearly 3 decades in prison, including long periods in solitary, admitted he killed Hart to receive the death penalty and rejected a plea deal for life imprisonment. While awaiting trial in 2011, he attacked a jail officer with a homemade weapon. On December 18, 2012, he was sentenced to death after pleading guilty and waiving his right to a jury recommendation. As of 2025, Robertson has spent 13 years on death row with no execution date scheduled. Ian Deco Lightbourn. In 1981, 31-year-old Ian Deco Lightbourn entered the home of Nancy O'Farrell at the Ocala Stud Farm in Marion County, Florida. He forced her into sexual intercourse and then shot her despite her pleas for mercy, stealing a necklace and some money before fleeing. Arrested through incriminating statements to inmates and evidence linking him to the crime, Lightbourn was found guilty of premeditated murder, felony murder during burglary, and sexual battery. On May 1, 1981, he was sentenced to death. As of 2025, Lightbourn has spent 44 years on death row with no execution date scheduled. Omar Blanco. In 1982, 28-year-old Omar Blanco broke into the home of John Ryan in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. During the burglary, he confronted 14-year-old Thalia Vezos, cut telephone wires, and shot John Ryan multiple times, leaving him to fall onto his niece's bed. Blanco fled but left behind identification in Thalia's watch. Arrested the next day based on eyewitness identification and forensic evidence, Blanco was convicted of first-degree murder and armed burglary and sentenced to death on June 21, 1982. As of 2025, he has spent 43 years on death row with no execution date scheduled. Bruce Douglas Pace. In 1988, 29-year-old Bruce Douglas Pace was linked to the murder of Floyd Covington in Santa Rosa County, Florida. Covington's taxicab was found abandoned in a wooded area, and his body was discovered about 12 miles away, having been shot twice in the chest with a shotgun. Pace was seen with the victim on the morning of the murder, had fingerprints on the cab's window, possessed a matching shotgun, and his clothing had bloodstains consistent with Covington's blood type. Arrested and indicted for first-degree murder and armed robbery, Pace was found guilty in August 1989, with the jury recommending death by a 7-5 vote. On November 16, 1989, he was sentenced to death. As of 2025, Pace has spent 36 years on death row with no execution date scheduled. Milford Wade Byrd. In 1981, 33-year-old Milford Wade Byrd, along with 2 motel residents, planned and murdered his wife, Deborah, at a Tampa motel. She suffered multiple scalp lacerations, gunshot wounds, bruises, and was ultimately strangled to death. Byrd was arrested after police uncovered evidence and obtained a confession he later recanted. During trial, one co-conspirator testified against him. On November 14, 1985, Byrd was found guilty of first-degree murder, and the judge sentenced him to death, citing premeditation, financial gain from a $100,000 life insurance policy, and the especially heinous nature of the crime. As of 2025, Byrd has spent 43 years on death row with no execution date scheduled. Kayle Barrington Bates. In 1983, 26-year-old Kayle Barrington Bates attacked Janet White at the State Farm Insurance office in Panama City, Florida. He forced her into the woods behind the building, beat her, attempted sexual assault, and ultimately murdered her. Bates was found at the scene with the victim's blood on his clothing, and additional evidence including fibers, his knife case, hat, watch pin, and semen linked him to the crime. Arrested at the scene, he was found guilty of kidnapping, attempted sexual battery, armed robbery, and first-degree murder. The jury recommended death, and the sentence was upheld after appeals and resentencing. As of 2025, Bates has spent 42 years on death row with no execution date scheduled. Milo A. Rhodes. In 1982, 34-year-old Milo A. Rhodes brutally murdered Robert Butch Richardson in Pinellas County, Florida. Witnesses saw Rhodes smash Richardson's head multiple times with a 35-pound concrete block in a well-lit area, and Rhodes admitted the killing to acquaintances. Arrested later that night, Rhodes was tried with eyewitness testimony and his own statements as evidence. On July 8, 1983, a jury found him guilty of first-degree murder and recommended death by a 9-3 vote. The court sentenced him to death, citing prior violent felony convictions, a murder committed while under sentence of imprisonment, and the crime's cold, calculated, and premeditated nature. As of 2025, Rhodes has spent 42 years on death row with no execution date scheduled. Joel Dale Wright. In 1983, 27-year-old Joel Dale Wright entered the home of 75-year-old schoolteacher Lima Page Smith in Palatka, Florida. He stole money, brutally beat, raped, and stabbed her 12 times in the face and neck, causing her to bleed to death. Wright confessed to a neighbor asking for a false alibi. Arrested soon after, evidence including his fingerprint on a stove and witness testimony led to his conviction. On September 23, 1983, he was sentenced to death after a jury recommended it by a 9-3 vote. As of 2025, Wright has spent 42 years on death row with no execution date scheduled. Derrick Tyrone Smith. In 1983, 20-year-old Derrick Tyrone Smith and an accomplice, Derrick Johnson, planned to rob a cab driver in St. Petersburg, Florida. When driver Jeffrey Songer sensed danger and tried to flee, Smith shot him in the back, killing him about 70 feet from the cab. Smith was linked to the crime through eyewitness testimony, fingerprints, and a matching .38 caliber revolver. Convicted and sentenced to death in his first trial, his conviction was overturned. But at a 1990 retrial, he was again found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. As of 2025, Smith has spent 42 years on death row with no execution date scheduled. Robert Ira Peedy. In 1983, 38-year-old Robert Ira Peed arranged to meet his estranged wife, Darla Peed, at the Miami airport in Florida. During the drive north, Peed inflicted a superficial knife wound to her side, then later stabbed her in the throat with a lock blade knife outside Orlando, killing her within minutes. He left her body in Georgia and was arrested in North Carolina. At trial, he confessed, signed a statement requesting the death penalty, and was found guilty of first-degree murder. On July 20th, 1984, the court sentenced him to death, citing prior violent felonies, murder during a kidnapping, and premeditation. As of 2025, Peed has spent 41 years on death row, with no execution date scheduled. Jason Dirk Walton. In 1982, 20-year-old Jason Dirk Walton, along with Richard Cooper, Terry Van Royal Jr., and his brother Jeffrey McCoy, entered a Pinellas County, Florida, residence intending to rob the occupants. They bound 3 adult male victims and locked an 8-year-old boy in a bathroom. Walton and his accomplices shot the men at close range, killing them. Arrested the following year after co-defendants cooperated, Walton confessed to being present but denied being the shooter. On August 29, 1986, the court sentenced him to death after a jury convicted him of 3 counts of first-degree murder. As of 2025, Walton has spent 43 years on death row with no execution date scheduled. Carl Puiatti. In 1983, 20-year-old Carl Puiatti, along with Robert Glock, kidnapped Sherilyn Ritchie in Bradenton, Florida. They robbed her, forced her to cash a check, drove her over 60 miles and left her in an orange grove. They later returned and shot her multiple times, ultimately killing her. Arrested 4 days later in New Jersey, both confessed, though each blamed the other for initiating the killing. Tried jointly with Glock, Puiatti was found guilty of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and robbery. On May 16, 1984, the jury recommended the death penalty by an 11-to-1 vote, and the court sentenced him to death, citing premeditation, pecuniary motive, and cold, calculated execution. As of 2025, Puiatti has spent 41 years on death row, with no execution date scheduled. Jeffrey Allen Muehleman. In 1983, 38-year-old Jeffrey Allen Muehleman, using the alias Jeff Williams, was hired by 97-year-old Earl Bauman in Pinellas County, Florida. That evening, Muehleman decided to rob and kill Bauman, striking him repeatedly with a frying pan, attempting to strangle him, and ultimately suffocating him with plastic wrappers from newspapers. He stole $150, wrapped the body in bed covers, and placed it in the trunk of the victim's car before attempting to destroy evidence. Arrested after police located the car, Muehleman confessed and pled guilty to first-degree murder. On August 25, 1983, the court sentenced him to death following a jury recommendation. As of 2025, he has spent 42 years on death row with no execution date scheduled. Gregory Allen Kokal. In 1983, 28-year-old Gregory Allen Kokal, along with his accomplice William O'Kelly, picked up hitchhiker Jeffrey Russell in Jacksonville, Florida. They drove him to Hanna Park, where Kokal and O'Kelly beat Russell, and Kokal shot him, then robbed him and left the body at the park. Arrested following witness testimony and evidence linking him to the scene, Kokal was indicted for first-degree murder. On October 4, 1984, a jury found him guilty, and during the penalty phase, they unanimously recommended the death penalty. On November 14, 1984, the court sentenced Kokal to death. As of 2025, he has spent 41 years on death row with no execution date scheduled. Norman Blake Mckenzie. In 2006, 38-year-old Norman Blake Mckenzie attacked Randy Wayne Peacock and Charles Frank Johnston in St. Johns County, Florida. Separating the victims, he assaulted Johnston with an axe and beat him again when he survived, then attacked Peacock inside the house with the blunt side of the axe and a kitchen knife, stealing their wallets and car. Arrested after forensic evidence linked him to the murders, Mckenzie represented himself at trial. On August 21, 2007, he was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder, and following a new sentencing phase in 2019, the jury unanimously recommended the death penalty. On February 10, 2022, the court sentenced him to death. As of 2025, he has spent 18 years on death row with no scheduled execution date. Joe Elton Nixon. In August 1984, 23-year-old Joe Elton Nixon approached Jean Bickner in the parking lot of Tallahassee's Governor's Square Mall. Under the pretense of needing jumper cables, he convinced her to give him a ride in her orange MG convertible. Once inside, Nixon assaulted her, forced her into the trunk, and drove to a remote wooded area. He bound her to a pine tree, placed a paper bag over her head, and set her ablaze using the car's convertible top. Forensic reports confirmed Bickner was alive during the attack. At his July 1985 trial, Nixon refused to participate, and his court-appointed lawyer admitted guilt to focus on sparing him execution. On July 30, 1985, a jury voted 10-2 for death, and the judge imposed the sentence. As of June 2025, Nixon has spent 40 years on death row with no execution date scheduled. Richard Wallace Rhodes Jr. In 1984, 30-year-old Richard Wallace Rhodes Jr. strangled Karen Narodka to death in Clearwater, Florida. He met her at a bar, took her to the abandoned Sunset Hotel, and manually strangled her during a violent struggle, fracturing her hyoid bone. He concealed her body in the building's rubble. Arrested on March 2nd while driving Narodka's car, Rhodes gave contradictory accounts, but jail informants testified he admitted to the murder. A jury convicted him of first-degree murder on August 19, 1985, and on September 12, 1985, he was sentenced to death. Though vacated in 1989, a 1992 resentencing jury reaffirmed the death penalty by a 10-2 vote. As of 2025, Rhodes has spent 40 years on death row with no execution date scheduled. Matthew Ted Marshall. In 1988, 28-year-old Matthew Ted Marshall, an inmate at Martin Correctional Institution, Florida, killed fellow prisoner Jeffrey Henry. On November 1st, Marshall entered Henry's cell, tied him up, and brutally beat him to death with a blunt object. Witnesses saw him leaving covered in blood, and forensic evidence contradicted his claim of self-defense. Arrested immediately, Marshall was charged with first-degree murder. His 1989 trial resulted in a guilty verdict, and although the jury recommended life, the judge sentenced him to death due to the extreme cruelty and his prior violent offenses. As of 2025, Marshall has spent 36 years on death row with no scheduled execution date. Manolo Rodriguez. In 1984, at age 28, Manolo Rodriguez participated in the murders of Bea Sabe Joseph, Sam Joseph, and Genevieve Marie Abraham in Miami during a robbery. He and an accomplice bound and shot the victims in the head, stealing jewelry and valuables. Rodriguez tried to mislead investigators, but in 1993, a tip led to his arrest after his accomplice confessed. In 1996, he was convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. As of 2025, he has spent 28 years on Florida's death row with no execution date scheduled. Harold Lee Harvey Jr. In 1985, at age 22, Harold Lee Harvey Jr. and an accomplice robbed and murdered William and Ruby Boyd in Okeechobee, Florida, to eliminate witnesses. Harvey shot both victims with an automatic rifle and executed Ruby Boyd when she moaned. Arrested 4 days later, he confessed to the killings. In 1986, he was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. As of 2025, he has spent 39 years on Florida's death row with no execution date scheduled. Kenneth Allen Stewart. In December 1984, at age 22, Kenneth Allen Stewart murdered Ruben Diaz during a robbery in Hillsborough County, Florida, shooting him twice in the head and setting his car on fire to destroy evidence. Arrested months later, he was convicted of first-degree murder in 1986 and sentenced to death. After multiple appeals and resentencing, his death sentence was repeatedly upheld. As of 2025, Stewart has spent 39 years on Florida's death row with no execution date scheduled. Grover B. Reed. In 1986, at age 24, Grover B. Reed raped and murdered Betty Orman in Jacksonville, Florida, after binding, assaulting, and killing her, then stealing valuables. Arrested a week later through fingerprints and recovered items, he was convicted of first-degree murder, sexual battery, and armed robbery, and sentenced to death in January 1987. As of 2025, Reed has spent 38 years on Florida's death row with no execution date scheduled. Mark Allen Davis. In 1985, at age 22, Mark Allen Davis murdered Orville Landis in St. Petersburg, Florida, by tying him up, beating him, slitting his throat, and stealing $500 before fleeing in Landis' car, which he burned. Arrested in 1987, Davis confessed but later claimed self-defense. Convicted of first-degree murder, he was sentenced to death in January 1987. As of 2025, Davis has spent 38 years on Florida's death row with no execution date scheduled. Paul Alfred Brown. In 1986, at age 36, Paul Alfred Brown broke into a Hillsborough County home, shot 17-year-old Pauline Kayle in the head, and also shot Tammy Byrd, who survived. Arrested shortly after with the murder weapon, he confessed. In 1987, Brown was convicted of first-degree murder, attempted murder, and armed burglary, and sentenced to death. As of 2025, he has spent 38 years on Florida's death row with no execution date scheduled. Michael Thomas Rivera. In 1986, at age 23, Michael Thomas Rivera abducted and asphyxiated 11-year-old Stacy Jasvak in Broward County, Florida. With a history of sexual offenses, Rivera was linked to the crime through witness testimony, confessions, and prior behavior. Convicted at trial, he was sentenced to death on May 1, 1987. As of 2025, Rivera has spent 38 years on Florida's death row with no execution date scheduled. Melvin Lee Trotter. In 1986, at age 27, Melvin Lee Trotter robbed and fatally stabbed 70-year-old Virgie Langford in her Palmetto, Florida grocery store. Identified through witnesses, physical evidence, and his confession, Trotter was convicted of first-degree murder and armed robbery, receiving a death sentence on May 18, 1987. As of 2025, he has spent 38 years on Florida's death row with no execution date scheduled. James Milton Daly. In 1985, at age 39, James Milton Daly was accused of murdering 14-year-old Shelley Boggio in Pinellas County, Florida. His conviction relied on jailhouse informants and co-defendant testimony with no direct physical evidence. Arrested, tried, and sentenced to death on August 7, 1987, Daly has consistently maintained his innocence. As of 2025, he has spent 38 years on Florida's death row with no execution date scheduled. William Reeves Jr. In 1986, at age 38, William Reeves Jr. shot and killed Deputy Richard Retzkowski in Vero Beach, Florida, during a struggle after calling 911 from a payphone. Reeves later confessed, citing panic and drug influence. He was tried and convicted of first-degree murder, receiving a death sentence on June 12, 1992, due to the murder of a law enforcement officer and prior violent record. As of 2025, Reeves has spent 39 years on Florida's death row with no execution date scheduled. Dominic Anthony Ocacone Sr. In 1986, age 41, Dominic Anthony Ocacone Sr. murdered his ex-girlfriend's parents, Raymond and Martha Artzner, in Pasco County, Florida, cutting phone lines and shooting both victims. Arrested and confessing, he was convicted at his 1987 trial, receiving a death sentence for Martha's murder and life for Raymond's. As of 2025, Ocacone has spent 38 years on Florida's death row without a scheduled execution date. John Dwayne Freeman. In 1986, at age 21, John Dwayne Freeman stabbed Alvin Epps to death in Tallahassee, Florida, during a burglary and later committed a second fatal burglary. Arrested and charged with first-degree murder, armed robbery, and burglary, Freeman's jury recommended life, but the judge imposed the death penalty on November 2, 1988. As of 2025, he has spent over 36 years on Florida's death row with no execution date scheduled. Richard Harold Anderson. In 1987, at age 39, Richard Harold Anderson conspired with his girlfriend Connie Beasley to rob businessman Robert Grantham after his return from Las Vegas. On May 7th, Anderson shot Grantham 4 times through the car window after Beasley got him intoxicated, leaving the body in a wooded area and stealing $2,600. Arrested weeks later, he was convicted of first-degree murder, armed robbery, and burglary in February 1988, receiving a death sentence on February 26, 1988. As of 2025, Anderson has spent over 37 years on Florida's death row with no scheduled execution date. Randall Scott Jones. In 1987, at age 19, Randall Scott Jones and accomplice Chris Reish encountered Matthew Paul Brock and Kelly Lynn Perry sleeping in a Chevrolet. After an argument with Reish, Jones returned and shot both victims 4 times, dragged their bodies into the woods, and desecrated Perry's body. Arrested weeks later in Mississippi and extradited to Florida, he was tried in March 1988 for 2 counts of first-degree murder, armed robbery, and burglary. The jury recommended death, and the judge sentenced him on May 28, 1991. As of 2025, Jones has spent 34 years on death row. Daniel Burns Jr. In 1987, at age 42, Daniel Burns Jr. killed Highway Patrol Officer Jeff Young during a traffic stop on I-75 in Manatee County, Florida, following a struggle over a supposed cocaine shipment. Arrested days later, he was tried for first-degree murder and trafficking over 200 grams of cocaine. Convicted on May 17, 1988, the judge sentenced him to death on June 3, 1988. As of 2025, Burns has spent 37 years on Florida's death row, with no execution date scheduled. James Aaron Duckett. In 1987, at the age of 29, James Aaron Duckett, then a police officer in Mascot, Florida, was accused of luring Teresa McCabe, an 11-year-old girl, into his patrol car after seeing her near a laundromat and, according to the indictment, sexually assaulted her, strangled her, and drowned her by throwing her into a lake near the place where the girl was last seen on May 11, 1987, her body being found the following day. He was arrested on June 15, 1987, and stood trial in April 1988, where he was found guilty of first-degree murder and sexual assault resulting in death. As of 2025, he has spent 37 years on death row and has no scheduled execution date. Samuel Jason Derrick. 1987, age 19. Samuel Jason Derrick was accused of entering the Moon Lake General Store in Pasco County, Florida, on the night of June 24 to 25, 1987, fatally stabbing 55-year-old owner Rama Sharma more than 30 times during what prosecutors said began as a robbery. Investigators found Sharma's body off a wooded path behind the store the next morning. He was arrested 6 days later after a friend testified that Derrick confessed to the killing. As of 2025, Derrick has spent 37 years on Florida's death row. Frank Athen Walls. In 1987, at the age of 19, Frank Athen Walls entered the mobile home of Edward Alger and Ann Peterson in Okaloosa County, Florida, on July 22, 1987, and brutally shot Peterson twice in the head and Alger 3 times before slitting his throat. Later confessing to 3 additional killings from 1985 to 1987, during which he preyed on young women and victims of opportunity. He was arrested days after the Okaloosa murders, when forensic and testimonial evidence tied him to the crime scene. The trial court formally imposed death on June 30, 1988. As of 2025, Walls has spent 37 years on Florida's death row. Anthony John Ponticelli. In 1987, at the age of 29, Anthony John Ponticelli lured 2 acquaintances, Ralph and Nicholas Grandinetti, to his car in Marion County, Florida, under the guise of selling cocaine. He then drove them to a secluded spot and fatally shot both men in cold blood during what prosecutors characterized as a robbery turned double homicide. He was arrested days later after ballistic and witness evidence tied him to the killings, and on September 6, 1988, a jury convicted him of 2 counts of first-degree murder, and the trial court imposed the death sentence following an 8-4 recommendation. As of 2025, Ponticelli has spent 37 years on Florida's death row. Richard Barry Randolph. In 1988, at the age of 26, Richard Barry Randolph, a former employee of a Handyway convenience store in Palatka, locked the store's front door on August 15th, and after disabling the security camera and tipping over a trash can to block entry, brutally beat store manager Minnie Ruth McCollum with a knife and left her semi-conscious amid overturned merchandise before fleeing the scene. Witnesses who arrived shortly thereafter reported the odd circumstances and alerted law enforcement. Deputies forced entry and discovered McCollum alive but gravely injured. Randolph was arrested soon after, tried in 1989, and on April 5, 1989, was convicted of first-degree murder, sexual battery, armed robbery, and grand theft of a motor vehicle, and sentenced to death by the 7th Judicial Circuit, Putnam County. He has spent 36 years on Florida's death row. Perry Alexander Taylor. In 1988, at the age of 22, Perry Alexander Taylor lured Geraldine Birch into the dugout of a Little League baseball field in Hillsborough County after she offered sex in exchange for money, whereupon he beat her to death following a brief sexual encounter. Witnesses Otis Allen and Adrian Mitchell saw Taylor and Birch walking toward the dugout, and upon discovery of her body, law enforcement identified matching shoe prints and obtained Taylor's confession. Taylor was arrested shortly thereafter, tried in May 1989, and on May 12, 1989, was convicted of first-degree murder, sexual battery, armed robbery, and related charges, and sentenced to death by the 13th Judicial Circuit. He has spent 36 years on Florida's death row. Richard Earl Scheer, Jr. In 1987, at the age of 21, Richard Earl Scheer, Jr. joined Bruce Demo on Christmas Eve for a rabbit hunt that ended in the early morning hours of December 25th, when Demo shot Drew Paul Snyder multiple times, and Scheer admitted firing rounds into Snyder's body after luring him into a secluded area during what began as a theft-related rendezvous. Scheer was arrested on January 15, 1988, and indicted for first-degree murder on February 2, 1988. As of 2025, he has spent 36 years on Florida's death row. George Michael Hodges. In 1987, at the age of 22, George Michael Hodges, a maintenance worker in Plant City, shot 20-year-old convenience store clerk Betty Ricks twice with a rifle in the parking lot at 6 a.m. on January 8th after she had filed an indecent exposure complaint against him. Deputies later linked matching shoe prints and eyewitness testimony to Hodges, arrested him in February, and recovered the murder weapon. He was tried April 18th to 21st, 1989, and on April 21st, 1989, convicted of first-degree murder and, following a 7-5 jury recommendation on April 26, 1989, formally sentenced to death by the 10th Judicial Circuit. He has spent 36 years on Florida's death row. Tony Randall Watts. In 1988, at the age of 21, Tony Randall Watts forced Glenda Gerardo at gunpoint into her Jacksonville home on February 18th after intercepting her on her morning jog, demanded money with threats to kill, stripped and sexually assaulted her before shooting her husband, Simon Gerardo, during a struggle. Witnesses later identified him. His fingerprints and hair were found inside the house, and the rifle was recovered. He was arrested in September 1988, tried July-August 1989, and on September 15, 1989, formally sentenced to death by the 4th Judicial Circuit. He has spent 36 years on Florida's death row. Norberto Pietri. In 1988, at the age of 25, Norberto Pietri, a work-release inmate at the Lantana Community Correctional Center, walked away on August 18th, and over the next 4 days burglarized homes and stole firearms and a pickup truck to finance a cocaine binge. On August 22nd, outside West Palm Beach, he used a stolen 9mm pistol to shoot Officer Bryan Chappelle once in the chest after a brief high-speed pursuit, then dumped the truck in a canal and evaded capture until officers arrested him following a chaotic car chase in foot pursuit on August 24. Indicted on September 22, 1988. He was tried and on February 7, 1990, convicted of first-degree murder and related felonies. He has spent 35 years on Florida's death row. Daniel John Peterka. In 1989, at the age of 21, Daniel John Peterka, having fled Nebraska prison terms for theft, arrived in Niceville, Florida, moved in with roommate John Russell, had Ronald LeCompte secretly purchase a .357 Magnum for him, and on June 27th obtained a Florida driver's license in Russell's name, which he used to cash a $300 money order meant for Russell. On July 12, after Russell confronted him about the missing funds, Peterka retrieved the handgun and shot Russell in the head inside their shared duplex. He was arrested shortly thereafter, tried in early 1990, and on April 25, 1990, convicted of first-degree murder and formally sentenced to death by the First Judicial Circuit. He has spent 35 years on Florida's death row. Juan David Rodriguez. In 1988, at the age of 31, Juan David Rodriguez, recently released on bail in Miami-Dade County, led accomplices to the rear of Sal's Auto Parts on May 13, feigned a transaction, then produced a handgun, demanded Abelardo Saladrigas' watch and briefcase, and after Saladrigas refused, shot him 4 times, fleeing with the stolen items. The victim died at the hospital. Arrested within days, Rodriguez was tried January 1990 and on March 28, 1990, convicted of first-degree murder, armed robbery, conspiracy, attempted armed robbery, armed burglary with assault, aggravated assault, and attempted first-degree murder, and unanimously sentenced to death by the 11th Judicial Circuit. He has spent 35 years on Florida's death row. Alan Ward Cox. In 1998, at the age of 36, Alan Ward Cox, an inmate at Lake Correctional Institute, discovered $500 missing from his footlocker on December 20th and offered a $50 reward to anyone identifying the thief. The next day, during the prison lunch period, he called fellow inmate Thomas Baker over to him, beat him with his fists, then repeatedly stabbed him with a homemade shank behind the pump house, fatally wounding Baker before returning to his cell and violently striking his cellmate Lawrence Wood. Law enforcement locked down the compound, identified Big Al from inmate reports, recovered the shank in a pump house pipe, and arrested Cox shortly thereafter. He has spent 25 years on Florida's death row. Jeffrey Lee Atwater. In 1989, at the age of 25, Jeffrey Lee Atwater entered Ken Smith's apartment at the John Knox Apartments in St. Petersburg on August 11, where he remained inside for about 20 minutes before fatally stabbing Smith multiple times and stealing his money. Neighbors discovered Smith's body that day, and Atwater was arrested that evening after several acquaintances reported that he had confessed to the killing. He has spent 35 years on Florida's death row. Mark Allen Geralds. In 1989, at the age of 22, Mark Allen Geralds, a carpenter who had worked on remodeling Tressa Pettibone's Bay County home, returned to the house on February 1st after observing the family's schedule, and once inside bound her wrists with a plastic tie, beat her with a blunt object, and stabbed her repeatedly in a cold, calculated attack that left her body on the kitchen floor amid overturned furniture and missing jewelry, and her husband's Mercedes gone. Neighbors' reports of suspicious pawned items, among them a gold herringbone necklace stained with the victim's blood, and matching plastic ties and shoe prints, led investigators to Geralds, who was arrested days later, tried in early 1990, and sentenced to death by the Second Judicial Circuit. He has spent 35 years on Florida's death row. Konstantinos Fotopoulos. In 1989, at the age of 30, Konstantinos Fotopoulos began an affair with bartender Deidre Hunt and lured his perceived blackmailer Kevin Ramsey to a secluded rifle range in late October, where Hunt shot Ramsey 3 times in the chest and once in the head on Fotopoulos's instruction before he finished the execution with an AK-47. Days later, he conspired with Hunt to kill his wife, Lisa Fotopoulos, hiring accomplices and ultimately gunning down Bryan Chase in November when that plot went awry. Police recovered the videotape of Ramsey's murder and matching weapons, arrested Fotopoulos in December, and he was tried in mid-1990. On October 15, 1992, he was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder, conspiracy, solicitation, attempted murder, and armed burglary, and formally sentenced to death by the 7th Judicial Circuit on the same day. He has spent 33 years on Florida's death row. Ronald Palmer Heath. In 1989, at the age of 32, Ronald Palmer Heath, accompanied by his younger brother Kenneth, met traveling salesman Michael Sheridan at the Purple Porpoise Lounge in Gainesville on May 24th, suggested they rob him after Sheridan bought them drinks and inquired about marijuana, then drove him to an isolated area in Alachua County, where Kenneth initially shot Sheridan in the chest during the robbery. Heath then kicked the wounded victim, stabbed him in the neck with a hunting knife, attempted to slit his throat, and ordered Kenneth to finish the execution with 2 shots to the head before they moved the body deeper into the woods, burned Sheridan's rental car, and used his credit cards the next day. Arrested weeks later when officers discovered Sheridan's watch and purchases, he has spent 35 years on Florida's death row. Jesse Guardado. In 2004, at the age of 28, Jesse Guardado, who had known his landlord Jackie Malone since 2003 and stayed in her secluded Walton County home, used her trust to gain entry on September 5th, robbed her of cash and valuables during a crack cocaine binge, then bludgeoned her repeatedly with a breaker bar, stabbed her 5 times in the chest, and slashed her throat twice, leaving her dead behind the couch. Deputies discovered Malone's body 2 days later. Guardado confessed on September 21st, 2004, and was arrested that evening. He pleaded guilty to first-degree murder on September 13th, 2005, and was formally convicted on September 15th, 2005. He has spent 20 years on Florida's death row. Gary Lawrence. In 1994, at the age of 27, Gary Lawrence, enraged after learning that Michael Finken had moved in with his estranged wife Brenda in their Tallahassee apartment, brutally beat Finken to death with a pipe and baseball bat on July 28th, leaving him bloodied and with his head caved in and throat impaled by a mop handle before wrapping the body in a shower curtain, driving it to a secluded area, and setting it ablaze. He has spent 29 years on Florida's death row. Ronald Wayne Clark. In 1985, at the age of 24, Ronald Wayne Clark, a former college football player turned construction worker, visited his ex-girlfriend Denise Howard at her Tallahassee apartment on June 17th after she rebuffed his calls and texts. During a heated argument over their breakup, Clark struck Howard repeatedly with a metal pipe, bound her wrists with electrical cord, and strangled her to death before ransacking the apartment and fleeing in her car. Neighbors reported hearing screams, and a witness saw Clark leave in Howard's vehicle. He was arrested 2 days later when the car was found abandoned nearby, tried in October 1986, and on October 29, 1986, convicted of first-degree murder and armed burglary, and sentenced to death by the 2nd Judicial Circuit. He has spent 39 years on Florida's death row. George James Treple. In 1988, at the age of 39, George James Treple, a former chemist and computer programmer in Alturas, Florida, surreptitiously added thallium, an industrial byproduct he had access to, from amphetamine production into multiple bottles of Coca-Cola in the Carr family refrigerator on October 15th, poisoning Peggy Carr and 6 family members. Peggy died after ingesting the toxin, while the others survived with varying degrees of illness. Undercover agent Susan Gorek, posing as a renter, uncovered a bottle of powdered thallium in Treple's garage in April 1989 and matching chemistry equipment and notes in his Sebring home, leading to his arrest on April 5, 1990. He has spent 34 years on Florida's death row. Guillermo Octavio Arbeláez. In 1988, at the age of 30, Guillermo Octavio Arbeláez kidnapped 5-year-old Julio Rivas on February 14th as revenge against the boy's mother, Graciela Alfara, his former girlfriend who had accused him of inappropriately touching one of her daughters and had begun seeing other men. Arbeláez strangled the child, drove him to Key Biscayne's Powell Bridge, and threw him 70 feet into the water below, causing death by asphyxia from both strangulation and drowning. Arbeláez fled to his family's home in Medellin, Colombia, but later returned to Florida and gave full confessions on audio tape and videotape, admitting that the best way to get to a woman is through her children. He has spent 37 years on Florida's death row. Michael Allen Griffin. In 1990, at the age of 20, Michael Allen Griffin, along with accomplices Samuel Velez and Nicholas Turallo, drove to the Holiday Inn Newport in Broward County on April 27th and burglarized a hotel room, stealing a cellular phone and purse. While attempting to flee, they were spotted by Metro-Dade police officers Joseph Martin and Juan Crespo. And when Turallo tried to pull over, Griffin declared he would not return to jail and opened fire on the officers, fatally shooting Officer Martin and wounding Officer Crespo before fleeing in the stolen Chrysler and being apprehended later that day. He has spent 34 years on Florida's death row. Rodney Tyrone Lowe. In 1990, at the age of 24, Rodney Tyrone Lowe entered the New-Pack convenience store in Indian River County on July 3rd, pointed a .32 caliber handgun at clerk Donna Burnell during an attempted robbery, shot her 3 times in the face, head, and chest, and left her to die. Investigators linked Lowe's fingerprint and vehicle to the scene, and after he voluntarily confessed following a brief interrogation, he was arrested and indicted on July 10th. He was tried February through April 1991, and on April 12, 1991, was convicted of first-degree murder and attempted armed robbery, with the jury recommending death on April 25th and the court formally sentencing him on May 1st, 1991. He has spent 34 years on Florida's death row. Stephen Edward Stein. In 1991, at the age of 28, Stephen Edward Stein, a cook at the Lem Turner Road Pizza Hut in Jacksonville, joined roommates Mark Christmas and Kyle White in a premeditated armed robbery on January 20th, during which he and Christmas shot shift supervisors Dennis Saunders and Bobby Hood to death before fleeing the scene. Neighbors reported gunfire, and Stein was arrested 3 days later on January 23, 1991. He was tried May 28th to June 20th, 1991, and on June 20, 1991, convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder and armed robbery, and formally sentenced to death by the 4th Judicial Circuit. He has spent 34 years on Florida's death row. William Earl Sweet. In 1990, at the age of 22, William Earl Sweet forced entry into Marcine Kofer's Jacksonville apartment on June 6th, while Kofer and her neighbor's daughters were inside, and opened fire with a .38 caliber handgun, killing 13-year-old Felicia Bryant and wounding 3 others before fleeing. Witnesses provided descriptions, and Sweet's fingerprints were later matched to the scene. He was arrested on June 28, 1990, tried in early 1991, and on May 24, 1991, was convicted of first-degree murder, 3 counts of attempted first-degree murder, and armed burglary, and sentenced to death by the 2nd Judicial Circuit. He has spent 34 years on Florida's death row. Emmanuel Johnson. In 1988, at the age of 25, Emmanuel Johnson entered 73-year-old Iris White's Sarasota home on October 4th under the pretext of discussing yard work, whereupon he choked her to unconsciousness, stabbed her more than 24 times, cut the phone cord, re-entered through a window to take her wallet, and fled. Police found White's body later that day, matched Johnson's fingerprints on the windowsill, and secured his taped confession on October 12th. He was indicted for first-degree murder on November 4th, 1988, tried in the spring of 1991, and on May 24th, 1991, was convicted of first-degree murder and armed burglary. On June 28, 1991, the jury's 8-4 recommendation was adopted, and he was formally sentenced to death. He has spent 34 years on Florida's death row. Billy Leon Kears. In 1991, at the age of 25, Billy Leon Kears, driving a dark blue Monte Carlo with passenger LaShawn Carter after a late-night party in Fort Pierce, ignored Officer Danny Parrish's signal to stop for a traffic violation on January 18th, drew a .38 caliber revolver when Parrish approached the car, wrestled Parrish's service weapon away during a scuffle, and fired 14 shots, 13 striking Parrish, killing him instantly. Witnesses heard the gunfire and described the getaway vehicle. Police broadcast a BOLO, recovered the Monte Carlo's plate, and arrested Kears and Carter the same evening. He has spent 34 years on Florida's death row. Anthony Mungeon. In 1990, at the age of 24, Anthony Mungeon walked into a Jacksonville convenience store on September 16th, produced a .25 caliber semi-automatic pistol, shot clerk Betty Jean Woods once in the head, and fled as she lay gravely wounded. A customer who discovered her recalled seeing a man hastily exiting with a paper bag, and investigators later matched the bullet to Mungeon's pistol recovered during his arrest in Kingsland, Georgia, on September 18th. Mungeon was tried January 25 to 28, 1993, convicted of first-degree murder on January 28, 1993. He has spent 32 years on Florida's death row. Stephen Richard Taylor. In 1990, at the age of 21, Stephen Richard Taylor returned to Alice Vest's mobile home in Jacksonville on September 15th, where he forced entry, sexually assaulted her, stabbed her more than 20 times with a knife and scissors, strangled her to death, and fled the scene amid evidence of burglary. Witnesses and forensic evidence, including a stolen Ford Ranchero found near Taylor's residence and Taylor's DNA matching semen on the victim's clothing, led detectives to seek and execute a search warrant, and Taylor was arrested on February 16, 1991. He has spent 34 years on Florida's death row. Chadwick Scott Willacy. In 1990, at the age of 22, Chadwick Scott Willacy forced entry into his neighbor Marley Sather's Brevard County home on September 5th, bludgeoned her with a blunt object, fracturing her skull, bound her wrists and ankles with wire and duct tape, strangled her with a telephone cord, then doused her with gasoline and set her on fire. Investigators found Sather's body amid charred remains, matched Willacy's fingerprints inside the house, and recovered stolen property at his residence. He was arrested weeks later, tried in late 1991, and on December 10, 1991, was convicted of first-degree murder, arson, burglary with assault, and robbery, and formally sentenced to death by the 18th Judicial Circuit. He has spent 34 years on Florida's death row. Antonio LeBaron Melton. In 1992, at the age of 20, Antonio LeBaron Melton, a transient who had been squatting in a Pensacola duplex, broke into neighbor Marlene Thomas's home on June 10, 1992, tied her wrists with electrical cord, bound her ankles, repeatedly stabbed her with a kitchen knife until she was unrecognizable, ransacked the residence, and fled with jewelry and a television set. Deputies responding to a silent alarm found Thomas's body in the living room. Fingerprints on the cord matched Melton's, and stolen items were recovered in his possession upon arrest 3 days later. He has spent 31 years on Florida's death row. Anton Joseph Krawchuk. In 1990, at the age of 31, Anton Joseph Krawchuk, who had maintained a casual homosexual relationship with David Staker, conspired with Billy Poirier the week before September 6th to rob and kill Staker. After arranging to visit Staker at his home, Krawchuk and Poirier watched television briefly before moving to the bedroom, where Krawchuk began choking Staker, while Poirier held his mouth shut and pinched his nose closed for nearly 10 minutes, after which Krawchuk poured drain cleaner into Staker's mouth twice before they bound and gagged him, placed him in the bathtub, stole electronics and firearms, loaded everything, including Staker's body, into his pickup truck, sold some items to Gary Sigelmeer, then dumped Staker's decomposing remains in a rural Charlotte County wooded area, where they were discovered on September 13th. Krawchuk confessed after waiving his Miranda rights when deputies arrested him and Poirier at their shared Lee County home, was tried in early 1992, pleaded guilty to first-degree murder, and on February 13, 1992, was sentenced to death by the 20th Judicial Circuit after the jury unanimously recommended death. He has spent 33 years on Florida's death row. Ernest D. Suggs. In 1990, at the age of 34, Ernest D. Suggs, a former dock worker in Walton County, entered the Teddy Bear Bar on the evening of August 6th, followed bartender Pauline Casey outside under the pretense of socializing, then stabbed her twice in the neck and once in the back amid a brief struggle before fleeing. Deputies found her body the next morning off a dirt road, recovered Suggs's keys and a beer glass from behind his home, and matched his fingerprints in the victim's blood on his shirt. He was arrested shortly thereafter, tried in June 1992, and on July 15, 1992, was convicted of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and robbery, and sentenced to death by the First Judicial Circuit following a 7-5 jury recommendation. He has spent 33 years on Florida's death row. Ronnie Boo Johnson. In 1989, at the age of 28, Ronnie Boo Johnson knocked on the front door of the Sparkle City Laundromat in Paraine, Florida, on March 11, asking for change from owner Tequila Sugar Mama Larkins. When she unlocked the door, Johnson barged in, began arguing with Larkins and physically fighting her, striking her repeatedly in the face before pulling out a gun and shooting her to death while customers Jerry Briggs, Valerie Briggs, Eric Bettel, and Walter Hills remained in the facility. He confessed to the crime on April 2, 1989. He has spent 34 years on Florida's death row. Gary Richard Whitten. In 1990, at the age of 33, Gary Richard Whitten drove acquaintance James Malden to a Destin bank on October 9th, where Malden withdrew $1,135.88, helped him check into the Sun and Sand Motel, then returned later that night to stab him to death with multiple fatal wounds before fleeing with the money. Investigators found Whitten's fingerprints on a bag near the body and blood spatter in his boots consistent with stabbing. He has spent 35 years on Florida's death row. Harry Jones Jr. In 1991, at the age of 29, Harry Jones Jr., after drinking heavily throughout the day in Tallahassee, convinced George Wilson Young Jr. to give him a ride and drove to a secluded pond where he attacked Young, breaking his arm and ribs, then held him underwater until he drowned while attempting to rob him. At 8:05 p.m., Jones crashed Young's red Ford Bronco and was hospitalized with a blood alcohol level of 0.269. He confessed to a cellmate. He was tried twice after the first ended in a hung jury, and on November 13, 1992, was convicted of first-degree murder, robbery, and grand theft and sentenced to death. He has spent 33 years on Florida's death row. Curtis Lee Wyndham. In 1992, at the age of 26, Curtis Lee Wyndham, after learning that acquaintance Johnny Lee had won $114 at a dog track while owing him $2,000, purchased a .38 caliber revolver at Walmart on February 7th and drove to where Lee was standing with friends, shooting him twice in the back, then twice more at close range as he lay on the ground. Wyndham then ran to the apartment complex where his on-again, off-again girlfriend Valerie Davis lived with her mother, Mary Lubin, fatally shooting Davis in the chest without provocation, and later shooting Lubin twice at a stop sign as she drove home from work upon hearing about her daughter. He was convicted on 3 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of attempted murder and sentenced to death by the 9th Judicial Circuit on November 10, 1992. He has spent 33 years on Florida's death row. Alfred Lewis Finney. In 1991, at the age of 29, Alfred Lewis Finney kidnapped Mary Elaine Sheeran at gunpoint on September 8th after forcing her into the trunk of her 1986 Cadillac in Tampa, drove with accomplice Michael Frazier to various ATMs attempting to use her credit cards, collected rope and concrete blocks, then took Sheeran to a remote wooded area in Hernando County, where he shot her once in the back of the head and left her body with hands bound behind her back. Police found Finney in possession of Sheeran's car, the murder weapon, and rope matching that used to bind the victim. He was tried in November 1992, convicted of first-degree murder, robbery with a firearm, and armed kidnapping, and on December 1, 1992, sentenced to death by the 5th Judicial Circuit. He has spent 33 years on Florida's death row. Dusty Ray Spencer. In 1992, at the age of 39, Dusty Ray Spencer returned to his estranged wife Karen's Orlando home on January 4th, beat her in the head with a household iron, and stabbed her repeatedly in their bedroom, killing her in a violent domestic assault. Arrested shortly thereafter, he was tried and on November 7, 1992, convicted of first-degree murder and formally sentenced to death on December 9, 1992. He has spent 33 years on Florida's death row. John Marquardt. In 1991, at the age of 34, John Marquardt, burdened by debts to Miami drug dealers, arranged a meeting with associate Carlos Rivera at a Little Havana parking lot on March 22nd, shot him twice in the back during an alleged money collection discussion, and left him to die before dumping the murder weapon in Biscayne Bay. Police recovered the car's GPS data and found Marquardt's fingerprints on the passenger door. He was arrested on April 5, 1991, tried in January 1992, and on February 14, 1992, convicted of first-degree murder and illegal firearm possession. And on March 3, 1992, the 11th Judicial Circuit formally sentenced him to death. He has spent 33 years on Florida's death row. Brett A. Bogle. In 1991, at the age of 22, Brett A. Bogle moved into Sister Katie Alfonso's Tampa home, and on September 13th, after a day of arguments with Alfonso's sister Margaret Torres, he forced his way inside, beat Torres, twisted her arm to silence her 911 call, fatally stabbed her multiple times, and fled. Police matched Torres's pubic hair and blood under her fingernails to Bogle's pants and found his fresh facial lacerations from a recent car accident consistent with eyewitness reports. Indicted October 2, 1991, he was tried the following year and on February 15, 1993, convicted of first-degree murder and related charges. The jury recommended death by a 10-2 vote, and the trial court formally imposed it. He has spent 32 years on Florida's death row. Frederick W. Cumming-el. In 1991, at the age of 30, Frederick W. Cumming-el, born Frederick Wooden, broke into the home of his former girlfriend Kathy Good in the early morning hours of September 16th, after she had obtained a restraining order against him for harassment and verbal threats, including, "If I can't have you, ain't nobody going to have you," and stabbed her several times while she was sleeping, killing her in front of her 8-year-old son Darius and 20-year-old nephew Michael Adams. Several witnesses saw Cumming-el flee the scene, including Good's mother Daisy Adams, who confronted him as he left the bedroom. Good staggered from the bedroom and collapsed in her mother's arms, saying, "Fred, Fred." He was convicted of first-degree murder and armed burglary and sentenced to death in 1993. He has spent 32 years on Florida's death row. Roderick Michael Orme. In 1992, at the age of 30, Roderick Michael Orme, on a cocaine binge, summoned nurse Lisa Red to Lee's motel room 15 on March 4th, beat and strangled her to death, ransacked the room, and fled. He was arrested days later, tried in early 1993, and on May 12, 1993, convicted of first-degree murder and robbery and sentenced to death by the First Judicial Circuit. He has spent 32 years on Florida's death row. Michael Lee Robinson. In 1994, at the age of 23, Michael Lee Robinson bludgeoned his girlfriend Jane Sylvia to death with a drywall hammer as she slept on their couch on July 25th, hitting her repeatedly in the head and stabbing her through the neck with a knife, then buried her body near Apopka Boulevard in Orange County after stealing her property and trading it for drugs several days earlier. Robinson confessed to Detective Griffin on August 16th, explaining he killed Sylvia both to retrieve money his mother had sent and to prevent her from pressing charges for the theft. He has spent 28 years on Florida's death row. Victor Tony Jones. In 1990, at the age of 31, Victor Tony Jones, on his second day as an employee for Matilda and Jacob Nestor, stabbed both employers to death in their office on December 19th, first attacking Mrs. Nestor in the bathroom and then stabbing Mr. Nestor in the chest when he came to investigate. During the struggle, Mr. Nestor shot Jones in the head before dying. Jones was found slumped on the office couch with a .22 caliber pistol under his arm and required surgery to remove the bullet. He was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder and 2 counts of armed robbery and sentenced to death by the 11th Judicial Circuit in 1993. He has spent 32 years on Florida's death row. John Loveman Reese. In 1992, at the age of 30, John Loveman Reese broke into his ex-girlfriend's friend Charlene Austin's Jacksonville home on January 28th, waited hidden until she fell asleep on the sofa, then strangled her with an electrical extension cord after raping her. His palm print on her waterbed led police to question and ultimately arrest him following his confession. He was tried March 22nd to 25th, 1993, and on March 25th, 1993, was convicted of first-degree murder, sexual battery, and burglary. The jury recommended death by an 8-4 vote, and on June 25th, 1993, the court formally sentenced him to death. He has spent 32 years on Florida's death row. James Eugene Hunter. In 1992, at the age of 28, James Eugene Hunter traveled with 4 accomplices from St. Augustine to DeLand on September 16th, where Hunter, armed with a silver handgun, robbed a man on the street before proceeding to Daytona Beach's Bethune-Cookman College area. There, Hunter and his group ordered 4 young men outside the Munch shop to give it up, robbed them at gunpoint, and Hunter shot each in turn, fatally wounding 19-year-old Wayne Simpson. A bolo on their gray sedan led Deputy Graves to stop the vehicle in Ormond Beach at 12:40 a.m., where Cowan and Simpson's fellow victim positively identified Hunter in the car. A search yielded the victim's belongings and 2 BB guns, though the murder weapon was never recovered. He has spent 32 years on Florida's death row. Quan M. Franklin. In 2001, at the age of 24, Quan M. Franklin, fresh from a trip to St. Petersburg with 3 friends and short on cash, pulled alongside night watchman Jerry Lawley in his parked car at the Alberta Crate and Box Factory on December 29th, produced a chrome revolver, ordered Lawley out at gunpoint, searched his pockets, and, finding no money, shot him once in the back, killing him. Franklin was arrested in St. Petersburg the next day, indicted for first-degree murder and attempted armed robbery on February 1, 2002, convicted in early 2004, and on June 3, 2004, formally sentenced to death by the Lake County Circuit Court. He has spent 21 years on Florida's death row. Robert A. Consalvo. In 1991, at the age of 29, Robert A. Consalvo drove neighbor Lorraine Petza to an ATM on September 21st and withdrew $200. Later, Petza realized $140 and her car keys were missing, and Consalvo denied taking them. On September 27th, Petza's body was found inside her Broward County apartment, stabbed multiple times, a bloody towel in Consalvo's bedroom, and his repeated use of Petza's ATM card 3 days after her death tied him to the crime. He was convicted of first-degree murder and armed burglary on February 11, 1993. He has spent 32 years on Florida's death row. Kenneth Hartley. In 1991, at the age of 24, Kenneth Hartley joined Ronnie Farrell and Sylvester Johnson in forcing 17-year-old drug dealer Gino Mayhew into his Chevrolet Blazer at gunpoint in a Jacksonville apartment complex on April 22nd, then drove off and fatally shot him 4 times in the head. Undercover informant Sidney Jones identified Hartley as the gunman, and Hartley was arrested on May 16, 1991. He was tried in early 1993, convicted of first-degree murder, armed robbery, and armed kidnapping on February 26, 1993, and formally sentenced to death on December 9, 1993. He has spent 32 years on Florida's death row. Troy Merck Jr. In 1991, at the age of 19, Troy Merck Jr. got into an altercation with James Anthony Newton outside a Pinellas County bar after closing time on October 12th, and when Newton told him to mind his own business. Merck went to his car, removed his shirt, approached Newton, and stabbed him repeatedly in the chest and throat, completely severing his carotid artery, and saying afterward, "I fucking killed him." Merck fled the scene with accomplice David Thomas, but was arrested later. He was tried twice after the first trial ended in a hung jury, convicted of first-degree murder on September 7, 1993, and sentenced to death. He has spent 32 years on Florida's death row. Thomas James Moore. In 1993, at the age of 19, Thomas James Moore conspired with Carlos Clemens and Vincent Gaines to rob his friend Johnny Parrish on January 21st, entering Parrish's Jacksonville home under the guise of drinking moonshine with him, then shooting him twice, once in the head and once in the chest, after demanding money. Moore and his accomplices set 2 separate fires to destroy evidence before fleeing. Moore voluntarily called police the next day, claiming he had only warned Parrish about seeing Clemens and Gaines with a gun earlier. He has spent 32 years on Florida's death row. Jack Relia Sliney. In 1992, at the age of 19, Jack Relia Sliney entered George Blumberg's pawn shop on June 18th with accomplice Keith Whitteman to purchase a necklace, got into an argument with Blumberg about the price, grabbed and wrestled him to the bathroom floor. Then, after Whitteman said, "You have to kill him, now," repeatedly struck Blumberg in the head with a camera lens, stabbed him 3 times in the neck with scissors, and beat him several more times with a hammer before fleeing with stolen jewelry and firearms. Sliney confessed after his arrest on June 28, 1992. He has spent 31 years on Florida's death row. Alvin Leroy Morton. In 1992, at the age of 19, Alvin Leroy Morton, accompanied by accomplices Bobby Garner and Tim Kaine, forcibly entered the Hudson home of John Bowers and his 75-year-old mother, Madeline Weiser, on January 26, shot Bowers in the neck with a shotgun after he pleaded for his life, then stabbed Weiser 8 times in the neck when the gun jammed, cut off Bowers' pinky finger as a trophy, and set mattresses on fire to destroy evidence. He was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder on March 18, 1994, sentenced to death on March 1, 1999, after the Florida Supreme Court granted a new penalty phase. He has spent 31 years on Florida's death row. Enoch D. Hall. In 2008, at the age of 49, Enoch D. Hall, an inmate at Tamaulipas Correctional Institution, serving 2 consecutive life sentences for sexual battery, lagged behind his work crew on June 25 while looking for pills in the PRIDE facility, and when corrections officer Donna Fitzgerald discovered him, he freaked out and stabbed her 22 times with a makeshift knife before wrapping her body in blankets, placing it on a cart in the paint room, and pulling down her pants. Hall confessed repeatedly after his apprehension, stating, "I freaked out. I snapped. I killed her." He was tried in October 2009, convicted of first-degree murder on October 23, 2009, with the jury unanimously recommending death, and formally sentenced to death in January 2010. He has spent 15 years on Florida's death row. Richard Eugene Bishop. In 2018, at the age of 49, Richard Eugene Bishop, while incarcerated at Union Correctional Institution in Rayford, murdered 2 fellow inmates in February through what the court described as especially heinous, atrocious, and cruel acts committed in a cold, calculated, and premeditated manner. The trial court found that Bishop had generational trauma, childhood neglect, physical and sexual abuse as a child, and had experienced 10 out of 10 adverse childhood experiences. He pled guilty to both counts of first-degree murder in February 2024, waived a penalty phase jury, and on September 16, 2024, was sentenced to death on both counts by the 8th Judicial Circuit. He has spent 1 year on Florida's death row. Dana Williamson. In 1988, at the age of 29, Dana Williamson broke into Bob and Donna Decker's Davie home on November 4th under the guise of visiting acquaintance Charles Pinoyan, bound Bob, his father and young son with handcuffs, forced Donna into an office closet, extorted legal forms, and stabbed her to death before shooting the men and fleeing. Pinoyan later identified Williamson after an anonymous tip led detectives to Ohio, and Williamson was arrested in early 1989. He has spent 31 years on Florida's death row. William Gregory Thomas. In 1991, at the age of 31, William Gregory Thomas planned the kidnapping and murder of his wife Rachel on September 12th to avoid paying his portion of their divorce settlement due the next day. Going to her house with friend Douglas Shroud, beating, binding, and gagging her, then dragging her back inside when she tried to escape by hopping outside, before putting her in the trunk of her car and driving off. Rachel was never seen again. He was indicted in May 1993, tried in 1994, and on July 22, 1994, convicted of first-degree murder, burglary, and kidnapping. The jury recommended death by an 11-to-1 vote, and he was formally sentenced to death. He has spent 31 years on Florida's death row. Jermaine A. Foster. In 1992, at the age of 19, Jermaine A. Foster joined Gerard Booker and Alf Catholic on November 29th in Polk County for a series of armed robberies. After forcing 2 men, Anthony Clifton and Anthony Fiella, to lie face down on the ground, Foster shot Clifton once in the back of the head and then shot Fiella twice, fleeing in a stolen red pickup. He was indicted March 4, 1993, tried in early 1994, and on July 18, 1994, was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder and related offenses. The jury recommended 2 death sentences, and on August 15, 1994, the circuit court formally imposed the death penalty. He has spent 31 years on Florida's death row. Leonardo Franqui. In 1992, at the age of 20, Leonardo Franqui and 4 accomplices robbed the Kislak National Bank drive-thru in North Miami on January 3rd, during which Officer Stephen Bauer was shot and killed as he escorted a teller with a cash box. Franqui fled in a stolen Chevrolet Caprice, but was identified when co-defendant Ricardo Gonzalez confessed on January 18th, and Franqui's own recorded statement implicated him. He was tried in May 1994, and on July 8, 1994, was convicted of first-degree murder of a law enforcement officer. He has spent 31 years on Florida's death row. Ricardo Maldonado Gonzalez. In 1992, at the age of 20, Ricardo Maldonado Gonzalez, along with accomplices Leonardo Franchi, Pablo San Martin, Fernando Fernandez, and Pablo Abreu, robbed the Kislak National Bank in North Miami on January 3rd, during which police officer Stephen Bauer was shot and killed. Gonzalez confessed 2 weeks later on January 18th that Franchi planned the robbery and supplied him with the gun he used, and that both he and Franchi fired their weapons, with Gonzalez's .38 revolver delivering the fatal shot. He was tried with Franchi and San Martin in May 1994, convicted on all counts including first-degree murder of a law enforcement officer, and on September 23, 1994, was sentenced to death by a 7-5 jury recommendation. He has spent 31 years on Florida's death row. Thomas H. Fletcher. In 2018, at the age of 50, Thomas H. Fletcher, serving a life sentence at the Blackwater River Correctional Facility, strangled his cellmate Kenneth Jeff Davis to death in their shared cell on September 22nd. He confessed that he killed Davis in order to be sentenced to the death penalty, pleaded guilty in August 2019, and on November 25th, 2020 was formally sentenced to death by the Santa Rosa County Circuit Court. He has spent nearly 5 years on Florida's death row. Floyd William Dameron. In 1994, at the age of 49, Floyd William Dameron entered RGC Mineral Sands in Clay County on May 1st with accomplice Jeff Chittum to burglarize the electrical shop in the maintenance barn, and when duty electrician Don Miller confronted Chittum, Dameron snuck up behind Miller and struck him with a steel pipe, continuing to bludgeon him despite Miller's pleas for mercy as he said he was going on vacation the next day to take his grandson fishing. He was convicted of first-degree murder, armed burglary, and aggravated assault and sentenced to death on June 2, 1995, with the jury unanimously recommending death. He has spent 31 years on Florida's death row. Ken Eldon Lott. In 1994, at the age of 41, Ken Eldon Lott broke into Rose Connors' Orlando home on March 27, bound her wrists and ankles with duct tape, struck her in the head with a blunt object, slashed her throat with a filler knife, fractured her larynx, and stabbed her in the back before fleeing with her diamond tennis bracelet and ring. Investigators matched Lott's palm prints on the sink and door frame, recovered the stolen jewelry pawned soon after, and arrested him in April 1994. He has spent 30 years on Florida's death row. Tony Darren Davis. In 1992, at the age of 22, Tony Darren Davis was entrusted with 2-year-old Kaliesha Cunningham while her mother ran an errand on December 9th in Jacksonville. Returning, a neighbor heard the child crying and thumping noises, and Davis, claiming she had choked on a French fry, administered mouth-to-mouth before calling 911. But medical examiners found multiple blows to the head, causing cerebral hemorrhage and signs of sexual battery. He has spent 30 years on Florida's death row. Marble Mendoza. In 1992, at the age of 25, Marble Mendoza and accomplices Humberto and Lazaro Cuellar hid behind a hedge outside Conrado Calderon's Hialeah home on March 17th, then ambushed him as he walked to his Ford Bronco. Humberto struck Calderon with a 9mm pistol, and Mendoza shot him multiple times with his .38 revolver before the trio fled. He was arrested days later, tried January 31st to February 8th, 1994, convicted of first-degree felony murder and related charges on February 8th, 1994, and formally sentenced to death on August 2, 1994. He has spent 31 years on Florida's death row. Ernest Whitfield Jr. In 1995, at the age of 28, Ernest Whitfield Jr. broke into Claretha Reynolds' Sarasota home, raped a resident, and stabbed Reynolds 21 times, causing her death. He was arrested the same day, confessed, and led police to the knife. Convicted of first-degree murder on October 20th, 1996, he received a death sentence. As of 2025, he has spent 29 years on Florida's death row. Robert Roy Gordon. In 1994, at the age of 31, Robert Roy Gordon participated in a murder-for-hire plot to kill Dr. Lewitt Davidson, a pediatric emergency physician in St. Petersburg. On January 25, 1994, Gordon accompanied Dr. Davidson to his apartment where the victim was beaten, bound, and drowned in his bathtub. Gordon was arrested on February 28, 1994, convicted of first-degree murder on June 15, 1995, and sentenced to death on November 16, 1995. As of 2025, he has spent 30 years on Florida's death row. Merrill S. McDonald. In 1994, at the age of 47, Merrill Stanley McDonald participated in a murder-for-hire plot orchestrated by Denise Davidson to kill her estranged husband, Dr. Louis Davidson, a pediatric emergency physician in St. Petersburg. On January 25, 1994, McDonald and co-conspirator Robert Gordon gained entry to Dr. Davidson's apartment, where they beat, bound, blindfolded, gagged, and drowned the victim in his bathtub filled with bloody water. McDonald was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. As of 2025, he has spent 30 years on Florida's death row. Ronald Allen Knight. In 1993, at the age of 25, Ronald Allen Knight conspired with two accomplices, Timothy Pearson and Dane Bernal, to lure Richard Kunkel from a gay bar in Palm Beach County with the intention of beating and robbing him. On July 8, 1993, they convinced Kunkel to leave his car and ride with them to a supposed party, then drove to a secluded area where Knight shot Kunkel execution-style in the back as the victim was complying with orders to remove his jeans. Knight and Pearson dragged Kunkel's dying body beside a canal, later returned to steal his car for a joyride, and broke into his home to steal items. As of 2025, he has spent 27 years on Florida's death row. Bobby Allen Raleigh. In 1994, at the age of 19, Bobby Allen Raleigh went with accomplice Domingo Figueroa to a D-Land trailer to confront Douglas Cox, then entered the home and fatally shot Cox and brutally attacked and killed Timothy Eberlin. He was arrested shortly after, pled guilty to 2 counts of first-degree murder on June 6, 1995. A jury unanimously recommended death on August 15, 1995, and he was sentenced to death on February 16, 1996. As of 2025, he has spent 31 years on Florida's death row. Presley B. Alston. In 1995, at the age of 23, Presley Bernard Alston kidnapped James Lee Kuhn from the University Medical Center parking lot in Jacksonville on January 22, 1995, where Kuhn had been visiting his grandmother. Alston forced Kuhn at gunpoint to drive to a remote location where he shot and killed him, then abandoned Kuhn's red Honda Civic behind a convenience store the next day. When Alston's girlfriend Gwinnetta McIntyre returned from out of town and confronted him about the stolen car, she noticed he had her .32 revolver and became suspicious upon hearing news of Kuhn's disappearance. He was arrested on May 25, 1995, and charged with first-degree murder, armed robbery, and armed kidnapping. He was sentenced to death on January 12, 1996. As of 2025, he has spent 29 years on Florida's death row. Leroy Pooler. In 1995, at the age of 47, Leroy Pooler went to his ex-girlfriend Kim Wright Brown's Palm Beach apartment, forced entry at gunpoint, shot her brother in the back when he tried to intervene, then chased and fatally shot Brown 5 times as she begged for her life. He was arrested on May 4, 1995, convicted of first-degree murder on March 29, 1996, and sentenced to death that same day. As of 2025, he has spent 29 years on Florida's death row. James Guzman. In 1991, at the age of 27, James Guzman broke into David Colvin's Daytona Beach motel room and stabbed him 19 times with a samurai sword during an armed robbery. Arrested on December 13, 1991, he was convicted of first-degree murder and armed robbery in September 1992 and sentenced to death. As of 2025, he has spent 33 years on Florida's death row. Robert J. Treese. In 1995, at the age of 42, Robert Jeffrey Treese and his accomplice Hope Siegel conspired to rob Paul Edenson, with Siegel arranging a date to learn where Edenson kept his safe. On August 17, 1995, when Siegel reported that Edenson had no safe, Treese went to the victim's home, battered him for information, shot him in the head with a non-lethal bullet when he remained uncooperative, then sent Siegel for a knife and cut Edenson's throat, killing him. Arrested on August 24, 1995 in Pennsylvania, Treese was convicted of first-degree murder, burglary, and robbery with a firearm on December 11, 1996, and was sentenced to death on January 22, 1997. As of 2025, he has spent 28 years on Florida's death row. Albert Richard Holland. In 1990, at the age of 34, Albert Richard Holland attacked and severely beat Thelma Johnson in Pompano Beach, rendering her semi-conscious with severe head wounds. When police officer Scott Winters responded to the scene and found Holland, they engaged in a struggle during which Holland grabbed Winters' service weapon and fatally shot the officer twice in the groin and lower stomach. Holland was arrested and charged with first-degree murder of a law enforcement officer, armed robbery, sexual battery, and attempted first-degree murder. After his first conviction was overturned by the Florida Supreme Court in 1994 due to improperly admitted psychiatric evidence, he was retried and convicted again in 1996, sentenced to death on February 7, 1997. As of 2025, he has spent 28 years on Florida's death row. Wayne C. Doty. In 1996, at the age of 22, Wayne Charles Doty shot and killed Harvey Horn II, a night watchman at a Plant City manufacturing plant, during a drug robbery on April 20, 1996, and was sentenced to life in prison. While serving his life sentence at Florida State Prison on May 17, 2011, at the age of 38, Doty and fellow inmate William Wells stabbed and strangled 21-year-old Xavier Rodriguez to death in his cell. Doty pleaded guilty to first-degree murder in 2012, was sentenced to death on June 5, 2013, had his sentence overturned due to constitutional issues, was retried in 2018 with a unanimous jury recommendation for death on May 15, 2018, and sentenced to death again. As of 2025, he has spent 14 years on Florida's death row for the Rodriguez murder. Andrew R. Lukehart. In 1996, at the age of 22, Andrew R. Lukehart dropped 5-month-old Gabrielle Hanshaw on her head while babysitting, then falsely claimed she'd been kidnapped. He confessed 18 hours later and led police to her body. Convicted of first-degree murder on March 7, 1997, and sentenced to death on April 4, 1997, he has spent 28 years on Florida's death row. Sean Smith. In 1996, at the age of 20, Sean Smith forced his way into Grazina Mlinarchik's Orlando apartment, raped her, placed a pillow and gun against her head, and shot her execution style. Arrested shortly after, he was convicted of first-degree murder on December 18, 1998, sentenced to death, and as of 2025 has spent 27 years on Florida's death row. Scott Mansfield. In 1995, at the age of 34, Scott Mansfield lured 24-year-old Sarah Robles from Rosie's Pub in Kissimmee, and, after purchasing groceries together at a nearby Winn-Dixie, strangled her until she asphyxiated and then mutilated her breasts and genitalia. He was arrested following the discovery of his blood-stained Grim Reaper ring and clothing, convicted of first-degree murder on November 10, 1997, and sentenced to death on January 30, 1998. As of 2025, he has spent 27 years on Florida's death row. Jason Demetrius Stevens. In 1997, at the age of 23, Jason Demetrius Stevens broke into Robert Sparrow Jr.'s Jacksonville house at 2 p.m., armed with a 9mm automatic gun, robbed 8 occupants, and kidnapped 3-year-old Robert Sparrow III at gunpoint. Forcing the child into a stolen green Kia, Stevens drove to a residential neighborhood and abandoned the boy in the locked car with rolled-up windows under 82-degree sunny weather, where the child died of heat exposure by 9:25 p.m. Convicted of first-degree murder on December 18, 1997, sentenced to death on January 15, 1998, and as of 2025 has spent 27 years on Florida's death row. Curtis W. Beasley. In 1995, at the age of 35, Curtis Wilkie Beasley was staying as a house guest at Carolyn Monfort's home in Dundee while doing work at her son-in-law's apartments. On August 21, 1995, Beasley severely beat Monfort to death in her laundry room, stole money she had received from a tenant, and took her car. Arrested in Alabama using a false identity, he was convicted of first-degree murder on February 18, 1998, and sentenced to death on May 22, 1998. As of 2025, he has spent 27 years on Florida's death row. Kevin D. Foster. In 1996, at the age of 18, Kevin Donald Foster, leader of the self-styled teen militia Lords of Chaos, murdered Riverdale High School music teacher Mark Schwebies. On April 30th, 1996, when Schwebies caught Foster and his accomplices attempting to vandalize the school and set the auditorium on fire, he told them to leave and said he would report them the next day. Foster and his group then planned Schwebe's murder, went to his home, knocked on his door, and when Schwebe's answered, Foster shot him twice with a shotgun, killing him. Convicted of first-degree murder in 1998 and sentenced to death, he has spent 27 years on Florida's death row as of 2025. David Miller Jr. In 1997, at the age of 37, David Miller Jr., heavily intoxicated from alcohol and crack cocaine, bludgeoned homeless man Albert Floyd to death with a 6-foot pipe outside a Jacksonville church while attempting to rob him. When Linda Fullwood, who was sleeping nearby, awoke and screamed, Miller also struck her before fleeing. Miller turned himself in to police 2.5 months later in Louisiana, admitting to the crime but claiming he only intended to disable Floyd, not kill him. Convicted of first-degree murder on June 26, 1998, and sentenced to death on July 24, 1998, he has spent 27 years on Florida's death row as of 2025. Carlton A. Francis. In 1997, at the age of 22, Carlton Anthony Francis stabbed and killed 66-year-old twin sisters, Claire Brunt and Bernice Flegel, in their West Palm Beach home, where they had lived together since 1983. Francis, who lived next door with his mother, Eleanor Goods, and was friendly with the victims, entered their home on July 24, 1997, and stabbed both women multiple times before stealing pocket watches, old coins, and their 1980s tan Pontiac Grand Prix. He was arrested on August 3, 1997, convicted of first-degree murder on July 29, 1998, and sentenced to death on November 17, 1998. As of 2025, he has spent 27 years on Florida's death row. Thomas D. Woodall. In 1996, at the age of 35, Thomas Davis Woodell entered the mobile home of 79-year-old Clifford Moody and his 74-year-old wife Bernice at Outdoor Resorts of America in Polk County on December 31, 1996. He stabbed Clifford 8 times in their rental trailer and Bernice multiple times before robbing them and fleeing. Their bodies were discovered after 1 p.m. that same day. Arrested on January 16, 1997, he was convicted on December 4, 1998, of 2 counts of first-degree murder, armed robbery, and armed burglary. After his initial death sentences were vacated and remanded, he was retried in 2004, sentenced to death for Bernice Moody's murder on July 1, 2005, and as of 2025 has spent 28 years on Florida's death row. LeBront D. Dennis. In 1996, at the age of 21, LeBront Dennis murdered University of Miami linebacker Marlon Barnes and his friend Timwanika Lumpkins, who was Dennis's ex-girlfriend and mother of his child. On April 13, 1996, after following Barnes and Lumpkins from a club, Dennis slashed the tires of Barnes's roommate's car, forced his way into their apartment, and beat both victims 22 times with the butt of a sawed-off shotgun, crushing their skulls. Barnes died at the scene, and Lumpkins died later at the hospital. Convicted of first-degree murder on October 27, 1998, and sentenced to death in February 1999, Dennis was removed from death row by the Florida Supreme Court in 2020 due to constitutional issues with his jury's 11-1 death recommendation, though prosecutors are seeking to reinstate his death sentence. Robert Dwayne Morris. In 1994, at the age of 31, Robert Dwayne Morris broke into 88-year-old Violet Livingston's Lakeland apartment, beat her with her walking cane, strangled her, and suffocated her. Arrested after DNA, fingerprint, and stolen coin evidence linked him to the crime, he was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death on April 30, 1999. As of 2025, he has spent 26 years on Florida's death row. Thomas M. Overton. In 1991, at the age of 29, Thomas Mitchell Overton stalked and strangled pregnant teacher Susan Missy McIver and her husband Michael McIver in their Islamorada home, killing both and their unborn child. He evaded capture for 6 years until DNA from semen at the scene led police to his arrest in 1997. Convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder on November 14, 2002, and sentenced to death on February 24, 2003, he has spent 22 years on Florida's death row as of 2025. Samuel L. Smithers. In 1995, at the age of 56, Samuel L. Smithers, a deacon and groundskeeper at First Baptist Church of Plant City, lured Tampa prostitutes Denise Roach and Christy Cowan to a vacant Plant City house under the guise of offering payment to mow the lawn. There he bludgeoned Roach with an axe and hoe, threw her body into a pond, and 2 weeks later picked up Cowan and violently beat her, before dumping her still-breathing body into the same pond. He was arrested after Marion Whitehurst discovered blood-soaked tools on her property, confessed during interrogation, and led police to the pond. Convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder on December 18, 1998, and sentenced to death on June 25, 1999. He has spent 26 years on Florida's death row. John Stephen Huggins. In 1997, at the age of 35, John Stephen Huggins abducted Disney employee Carla Larson from a bus stop near Epcot on June 10th, drove her to a secluded area in Duval County, and murdered her. Arrested in September 1998, he was convicted of first-degree murder on February 3, 1999, and sentenced to death on September 19, 2002. As of 2025, he has spent 23 years on Florida's death row. Daniel Owen Conahan, Jr. In 1996, at the age of 41, Daniel Owen Conahan, Jr. lured 24-year-old Richard Montgomery, a transient he met at a bus stop, into a remote wooded area in Punta Gorda, where he strangled Montgomery, removed and mutilated his genitalia, and left his body covered with carpet padding. Conahan was arrested in May 1996 after an undercover investigation, tried without a jury, and found guilty of first-degree murder and kidnapping on November 1, 1999. He received a death sentence on December 10, 1999. As of 2025, he has spent 25 years on Florida's death row. Gary Wayne Hertz. In 1997, at the age of 20, Gary Wayne Hertz and 2 accomplices invaded Melanie King and Robin Keith Spears' home in Wakulla County, bound the victims, shot them execution-style, loaded their belongings into stolen vehicles, and set the house ablaze. Hertz was arrested the same day, convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder on December 9, 1999, and sentenced to death on February 18, 2000. As of 2025, he has spent 25 years on Florida's death row. Howard Stephen Alt. In 1996, at the age of 29, Howard Stephen Alt lured 11-year-old Deanne Mumine and her 7-year-old sister Alicia Jones to his Fort Lauderdale home with the promise of Halloween candy, raped Deanne in front of her sister, then strangled both girls and hid their bodies in his attic. He was arrested in November 1996, convicted of first-degree murder on August 11, 1999, and sentenced to death on March 14, 2000. As of 2025, he has spent 25 years on Florida's death row. Micah Lewis Nelson. In 1997, at the age of 22, Micah Louis Nelson broke into 78-year-old Virginia Brace's Polk County home through a bathroom window, sexually assaulted her. Arrested on November 17, 1997, he confessed during interrogation and led police to her body. Convicted of first-degree murder on March 17, 2000, and sentenced to death that same day, he has spent 25 years on Florida's death row as of 2025. Paul Anthony Brown. In 1996, at the age of 29, Paul Anthony Brown kidnapped and murdered 68-year-old Ralph Stewart and his 64-year-old wife Ruth in their Port St. Lucie home, shooting them both execution-style after forcing entry to steal cash. Arrested on April 26, 1997, Brown was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder on March 12, 1998, and sentenced to death on May 21, 1998. As of 2025, he has spent 27 years on Florida's death row. Anthony A. Spann. In 1997, at the age of 23, Anthony A. Spann drove the getaway car for a pawn shop robbery, then conspired with Leonard Fillmore to carjack a Lexus and planned to kill its driver so she couldn't identify them. On November 14, 1997, they followed 56-year-old Kazue Perron to her Martin County home, forced her into her car at gunpoint, and shot her execution style. Spann was arrested 3 days later, convicted of first-degree murder on May 24, 2000, and sentenced to death on June 23, 2000. As of 2025, he has spent 25 years on Florida's death row. Jonathan H. Lawrence. In 1998, at the age of 23, Jonathan H. Lawrence and co-defendant Jeremiah Rogers lured 18-year-old Jennifer Robinson to a secluded area in Santa Rosa County, where Robinson was shot in the back of the head, dissected, and buried by Lawrence and Rogers. Lawrence was arrested after investigators found Polaroid photos, refrigerated human tissue, and handwritten notes detailing the plan during a search of his home. He pled guilty to principal to first-degree murder on March 24, 2000, and was sentenced to death on August 15, 2000. As of 2025, he has spent 25 years on Florida's death row. Leonard James Fillmore. In 1997, at the age of 21, Leonard James Fillmore and Anthony A. Spann followed 56-year-old Kazue Perron in her Lexus through a Martin County neighborhood, carjacked her at gunpoint, forced her to drive them to a remote area, and Fillmore shot her once in the head when she resisted. Arrested after a high-speed chase and confession on November 21, 1997, Fillmore was convicted of first-degree murder, carjacking, kidnapping, robbery, conspiracy, and grand theft on January 20, 2000, and sentenced to death on July 21, 2000. As of 2025, he has spent 25 years on Florida's death row. Johnny Huggins. In 1997, at the age of 35, John Stephen Huggins abducted Disney employee Carla Larson from a bus stop near Epcot on June 10th, drove her to a secluded area in Duval County, and murdered her. Arrested in September 1998, he was convicted of first-degree murder on February 3, 1999, and sentenced to death on September 19, 2002. As of 2025, he has spent 23 years on Florida's death row. Tina LaSonia Brown. In 2010, at the age of 39, Tina LaSonia Brown ambushed 19-year-old Audriana Zimmerman in their Escambia County mobile home community, stunned her with a taser, gagged her, stuffed her into a car trunk, drove her into nearby woods, beat her with a crowbar, doused her in gasoline, and set her on fire. Zimmerman succumbed to her injuries 2 weeks later. Brown was arrested in April 2010, convicted of first-degree premeditated murder on June 21, 2012, and sentenced to death on September 28, 2012. As of 2025, she has spent 13 years on Florida's death row.